Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Gerhardt Center Speaker Series. Thank you to the AUC for hosting us. The topic of the series is financing nature. My name is Hossein Allem. I'm the general partner of a newly established fund called the Climate Resilience Fund, which invests in nature-positive solutions. I want the speakers this evening to imagine that the world was running out of air, something that we've always kind of taken for granted. If we're running out of air, pretty soon we'd have to attribute a value to it, measure its scarcity, where to get it back, and start getting ready to pay a price for it. That's sort of where the financing nature crisis or the financing nature theme emerges from, similar issues. Our speaker tonight is the fascinating Dr. Vian Sharif, who has an extremely interesting life story, but also a professional story, and we welcome her to the series tonight. Dr. Vian Sharif is the founder of NatureAlpha, which we'll hear more about, and the head of sustainability for the FNZ Group, a platform for wealth managers. Welcome, Vian. Vian, we're going to run this more kind of podcast format, so questions back and forth between you and I, but welcome to the series. Could you maybe just start us kind of from the top and tell us what to you is financing nature about, and why is it important?
Sam, and to everybody who's joined, a huge thank you for this opportunity tonight to talk to you about something that's hugely important to me and something that I've had the pleasure of dedicating my life to. And as you said, it's easy to take nature for granted. So imagine you wake up in the morning, you have your breakfast, you take a piece of a fruit to eat, you might have some toast, you might have some cereal, you'll drink some milk. Around you, you're breathing air, you're sitting on furniture that's probably made in part from wood or something that comes from nature. And really what became very clear to me throughout my career, inspired by a love of nature, is that without nature, which is really significantly under threat, and we can go into the stats around that, we really won't have the sort of life that we're all used to living. I think there was a really interesting stat that Whole Foods put out. If you didn't have the sort of biodiversity that we have today, what would you end up eating? And the answer is, without the pollinators, you'd be eating a lot of cauliflower. So I think there are lots and lots of things that we can discuss today about why nature is so important and why the traditional mechanisms that we've thought about for preserving nature perhaps need to be rethought, and significantly why today and now is the moment for rethinking that through the lens of nature markets.
But nature has always existed for us. Why does financing it suddenly come into play?
I think that's a great question. So we noticed that previous approaches which have taken into account philanthropic approaches, so charitable giving towards nature, really counts for only about 3% of US charitable giving, for example. And so what we're starting to see is the risk of nature having an effect on the sorts of returns that the companies in which we're investing in are delivering to us as investors in the world of finance is starting to become a really serious systemic issue. So, for example, it's been a dream come true to me to start to see the regulator starting to notice that currently now $44 trillion worth of our GDP is either moderately or highly dependent on nature. So we've already talked a bit about that and breaking down what that means. 1 million species are at risk of extinction. And if we don't take account of this species loss, this acceleration in that area, we won't achieve the goals that we've set ourselves as a planet. So, for example, 80% of the UN Sustainable Development Goals are dependent on biodiversity for their achievement. And so we started to see the regulator take notice of the fact that businesses and the finance industry that is investing in those businesses needs to start to take account of what those businesses are doing in relation to nature. So I think it's a very interesting moment for now, both mainstreaming how we think about nature in the context of investment decision-making, but also thinking about a profound shift in the environmental and societal impacts of how we invest in what companies we choose to invest in.
Jan, both the organizations you're involved with, FNZ and NatureAlpha, which is your own organization, are involved in the data of nature. So acquiring it, packaging it, showing its relevance. What is the role of data in the climate finance debate?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question, Azam. And I guess the way of thinking about this is, if we can't understand our impact, then it's very hard to do anything about it. We all instinctively know that something's wrong. There's awareness out there. It's very clear, 3 themes. Awareness is there. We know that something's going on in the world around us. Many of us feel deeply connected to nature. We see role models, Sir David Attenborough, Prince William, Leonardo DiCaprio talking about these issues. Then we have the regulator raising awareness from the business side. But also, the thing that's really changed about today is that we have the technology to actually start to reveal the impact of a company's activities, or let's say the environmental visibility of what's actually happening in the natural world. So this could be using satellite data, this could be using sensors and data in the field, so that we can actually start to see what environmental changes are happening. There's eDNA, so we can start to actually measure using river water what species are there and what species aren't there anymore. So the level of technology that's underpinning the sorts of data that we can now get on global biodiversity, on nature, is unprecedented. And in the words of the former Vice President Al Gore, I think we're entering this age of really profound radical transparency. So it's an interesting moment powered by technology, which is driving the sort of data that we have available to us to start realizing these impacts.
I started my career offshore, studying the impacts of ocean patterns and currents and sediment movements on oil and gas operations.
Right.
Plenty of money to find then for studying the impact of nature on development, but why is it such a struggle why do we have to have webinars and speaker series to study the impact of development on nature?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting and evolving field. And for a very long time, this idea that you could even begin to start to understand how nature works. There's a big scientific body of literature, which I was lucky enough to work on when I did my PhD, which helps us start to understand the impact of species loss or model it. But translating that into something that's usable by business is a big translation process. So most of the time, I either feel like I'm a double agent or I'm a translator, because what we're trying to do is create links between various different disciplines, transdisciplinary work that connects the amazing scientific work with the technology that we need to make it really useful for finance decision makers. And you've got to remember, for a financial decision maker, and we can come on to why finance is so important in a moment, it's really the lifeblood of the system we've created around us. If we are to start to think about the mind of an investor, really, we're trying to imagine the risks to my investment in the future, the impacts of my investment on the world around me. And nature isn't necessarily going to be the first thing I think about. It's going to be, how am I going to deliver the returns in an appropriate way? And with the rise of different views of risk and environmental impacts, it's increasingly becoming clear that there are different factors that have an impact on the companies in which we invest, including what might be the case for nature-related impact or dependency. We can talk about a few examples if you like.
I think we'll get there, Vian, but you said impact of nature on business, and that I can see a business case for immediately. But the impact of business not on nature, that's kind of the field that you're in. So can you perhaps, just getting down to nuts and bolts, give us some practical examples of the sorts of data that NatureAlpha, for example, acquires and packages and presumably will sell to investors so they understand the impact that their investments are having? Can you just kind of give us some, just examples of data sets and how they're presented?
Yes, of course. So first of all, as I mentioned, we take from the scientific literature. So we work very closely with partners like IUCN, IBAT, and Encore, Science-Based Targets Network, to look at the established literature on what constitutes a sector's impact on nature. So this is some of the world's most authoritative data in the area of species abundance, species richness. And using that, we're able to take financial data on a company, combine these two elements, and then also start to understand not just the impact of an industry on the world around us in terms of nature, but also if we understand where these companies are located, where their operations are located, where the supply chain is located, what we can also start to do is map those company locations with geospatial data. So where in the world and how close are these companies to really important areas of biodiversity or critically endangered species range states. We can then start to overlay satellite data. So we can start to see, how has the tree cover changed over time? How has the water stress changed over time? And a really practical example, for example, if I'm a textile company, I'm using a lot of water in my production, I'm located in an area that is in an area of high water stress, in an area that's right on the edge of a critical ecosystem, then I might suddenly be able to pinpoint the fact that, okay, am I going to be able to continue doing this in this way moving forwards, or am I going to be forced in time to think about moving my operations to somewhere that is less damaging to that area? So the sorts of data that we can combine, we really just bring it all together like an aggregator. And as this data starts to improve, we can layer and layer and layer new layers of data into these insights to give us more and more precise information, time series data on what's really going on in the world around us. And that's probably the most exciting thing. I feel like we're really at the start of a journey that's just getting going. We're here really at the birth of what I always call it, a new asset class. It's a really exciting place to be.
Not to split hairs too much, but I mean, science has been collecting reams of data for many years and studying ocean currents and storm patterns and crop formation and crop shrinkages. How does artificial intelligence, how does machine learning creep into this? I just wanted to touch on it briefly and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So one of the things we touched on as an important moment in time is data and technology, the technology to be able to process the amount of data that we can actually ingest. So before now, it was hard to process this amount of data. Geospatial data is fiendishly large, it's hard to process. But what we have now is we have that element of data gathering. We also have inputs from the disclosures of the companies themselves. So what is this company reporting that it's using in terms of its water? How is that changing over time? So really what we're building up is a base layer, a baseline from which all these inputs can start to combine so that over time we can start to really pinpoint the material issues that are starting to pop up for a company. So in the case of that textile company, it could be, okay, I'm noticing that in this location, there's a lot of water being used and it's in a water stressed area. How can we start to engage with that company for it to make change? Perhaps it might think about reducing its consumption. And that's where the role of finance is so powerful. Maybe we can talk about that in a moment.
Yes, well, I'm coming to that now. So we've talked about how the importance of the quality of data and of the breadth of data and how it's presented. And we've talked about how investment decisions, whether to go or not to go, can be based around some of the data that we're talking about here. But there's also the reverse, right? If you're looking at areas where land has been degraded, forest cover or jungle cover has been damaged and needs to be rehabilitated, you can use machine learning to look at where there are most pressing needs. But that brings us to what will the cost and what's the fair value of rehabilitating. Now, this this may be taking you outside of your sort of the or natural comfort level here or comfort zone, and I'm also getting some pressure on the Q&A to start talking about how do you value nature when you now know what's missing and what needs to be introduced. What discussions are you having with stakeholders? What are you hearing and learning around how people are starting to think about the value of rehabilitating or reintroducing nature?
Yeah, and there are a few questions there, I think, and we can address them all. So let's start with companies who are now starting to understand through the visibility that they have, or even the aspiration that they have. They want to be part of the solution. Companies who are looking to be what is termed nature positive, which means understanding that, yes, they know they're having an impact, but they're keen to either mitigate that impact or actually start to restore those areas that they're having an impact in. And we're seeing that. So I would say there's a really big spectrum of companies. There's companies who haven't thought about biodiversity at all, but because the regulation's coming in, they're now looking at it from the perspective of, I'm going to have to disclose some of these things. I'm going to have to start to understand some of my priority areas. But then right at the other end of the spectrum, you have a set of companies who are seriously investing in nature. So they're either pinpointing areas that they can restore or where they can mitigate their own activities. And really, this is a crucial moment for that kind of activity. What we're going to start to see in October is the launch by IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, of a definition of what nature positive is. And that, I think, is going to be a watershed moment for companies to actually understand, all right, I'm here on this scale, and these are the actions I now need to perform so that I can start to take those steps to become nature positive. And that then brings us on to the valuation piece. So there are various different views on this valuation component. So there are some schools of thought which say nature has an intrinsic value. We all know how we feel if we walk into an incredible landscape, if we look at a sunset. I myself was inspired to come down this path because of my own experiences in nature in sub-Saharan Africa. But there's also another school of thought where if you can price the risk of the impact of an investment on nature, or the cost to restore, or even the dependency that you have on a certain ecosystem service, so water or air or soil or pollinators, then we can start absolutely to assign a value to that asset and say, for this company, this is how much it's using in natural capital. And those sorts of approaches are very, very cutting edge, and they are happening now. Whether they get adopted by the market, I think we're going to start to see. For some, I can't hear you, but I don't know if that's just me.
No, that's not just you, that's everybody, because I had myself on mute. You would think after years of COVID, we'd figured this out. No, I was going to talk about market uptake, which is kind of where you left off. And I wanted to, let's talk about that for a moment, because of course we have the Mark Carney's Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And he was almost at the point of getting a whole, raft of asset managers and investment banks on board. But then they all signaled, a pullback from that last week. It's almost like when real, what's the word I'm looking for? When real commitment or real obligation was placed upon them, they took a step back. And that must be enormously disappointing for you, because that shows that they're perfectly happy to pay lip service to good process like what you're introducing. But when it starts resulting in concrete data and valuations and it's time to pay, then they start fretting about the liability and stepping back. I understand it from a business perspective, but the question to you is this: will the business imperative be able to transcend and start talking realistically about nature?
Yeah, it's a really good observation. I think there were a few caveats around what happened with GFANZ, but if we turn to nature, what I've seen is very encouraging in that we have, I would say, significant regulation coming in around nature. So we have the EU mandating certain biodiversity disclosures in the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Review. We have the Task Force for Nature-related disclosures, setting out a framework for how these disclosures can be reported on. We also have the Carbon Disclosure Project adding biodiversity into their questionnaire, so publicly available disclosures. One observation I would have, 100 companies who've signed up to the Finance for Biodiversity pledge, some asset managers, some companies. So the timeline is coming really fast for those commitments to be honoured. And what I've seen is amazing levels of engagement around this. Now, there's always this question for asset managers and investors. This disclosure is not easy to do in many ways. It's a new narrative, it's a new area that needs to be learned, needs to be absorbed, needs to be implemented across companies. And I think we don't have much time because nature is at risk, but equally we do have to support those communities in understanding what they need to do and how they need to do it. So I'm, as a conservationist at heart, always optimistic that this can happen, but also to be clear, disclosure by itself is not the answer necessarily. Look where we've got to in climate. I'm sure you've got some observations on that now. But I think that climate did pave the way for nature. And if we can help and support adoption in an easy to consume way, then I think we have an opportunity to get this right. And maybe that comes on nicely to the behavior change piece.
I'm not there yet on behavior. I'm going to get to that in a moment. I just wanted to just ask one more question around the last part, which is this. The nature of data gathering and analysis is by definition highly local, when in reality the climate and nature crisis is a very regional, global, cumulative effect. How will we bridge that discrepancy between, localized analysis and globalized impact? It makes not make it almost impossible to attribute value to the correct payer.
Yeah, and it's really hard. That's why biodiversity, I think, has become, or nature is perceived to be harder than, let's say, carbon. It is very geographically specific. It's very hard to get visibility on companies' operations, and it's hard to attribute impact to a company's operations as well. But that's where it's so important that we have policymakers who are guiding the way. And I think we're, again, at this seminal moment for nature. At the end of this year, we're going to have a renegotiation of the Convention for Biodiversity, which will reset our global goals for achieving nature positive outcomes or biodiversity preservation for the next 20 years. So with policymakers discussing this and setting a path, which we hope to see happen, that hopefully starts to set at the global level some elements of target aspiration in a way that's probably as powerful as it's ever been. And then we have the ability of the technology that we've discussed and the disclosures that are being required to start to gather some of this information at local and country level. So again, I am hopeful that we can achieve both change globally, but also using local information. It is possible to do. And I have to say, we have to start somewhere. We could continue always saying it's too hard, or how do we mesh everything together? And the answer is that business, science, and policymakers, they each speak slightly different languages, and they're finally trying to come together to align in a way that's positive for these collective global goals that we all want to achieve at every level.
So fast forward 10 years and the climate is what it is. And policymakers are relying on machine learned data sets. Where does an organization like yours, NatureAlpha, sit? Are you one product that they draw upon? Do you cover one region, or have you been rendered obsolete because there is a global? Forgive me, right? But I mean, let's speak frankly. Is there a global product that has been adopted that governments have backed, and is the now global standard? I mean, how will data be used 10 years down the road? I realize that you can't see the future, but like a realistic scenario.
Yeah, it's a great idea to discuss this. Ever since I fell in love with nature, which was 12 years ago now, really encountering some of the world's most incredible nature, just on a drive in the middle of Kenya, it became really clear to me that we had to do something to incorporate nature into the world around us, the everyday decisions that we make. And because I had the privilege of working in finance, my route was the financial sector for implementing this awareness. So NatureAlpha's mission from day one has always been to mainstream nature into every decision that is made on investment. And that's about $120 trillion worth of money that's in global capital markets. Now, if we can achieve that in the next 1 or 2 years, then the mission will be complete. And we are a B Corp. I believe that we can both give back to society and we can equip business to mainstream this idea that nature is important into every decision. So I'm not sure I mind what happens in the future as long as we're facilitating that awareness. That's the mission that we need to achieve. The second part to your question is, will there be one set something metric or data source that everybody at government level backs? What I've seen in terms of how finance institutions consume data is that every investment decision maker wants to have its way of selecting investments, its way of thinking about the world around it. That's what makes it different. And so I wonder, we may come up with one silver bullet, one unit that is the definition of biodiversity, possibly. But I still think that there is room for complementary data sets, which will only increase our understanding of the world around us. So I don't know that there will be just one. I think there will be increasing numbers of fascinating data as the technology evolves. So that would be my view on life.
Do you not think it'll turn out like credit ratings agencies? I mean, there's not an infinite number of credit ratings agencies. There's 3 or 4, and people kind of have to usually reference several of them. Is that not where this will end up, as opposed to just ever increasing sets of data that you can essentially choose the one that tells your story?
Well, I think that's a very perceptive point. The thing is that already there is a movement away from rolled up ratings when it comes to ESG. We're already seeing that. We're looking at a number of cases where the finance industry and corporates don't want to just have a bundled up rating, because if you think about it, we've discussed, there are myriad different inputs to nature. Just one thing, if you think about putting environmental issues, societal issues, and governance issues together and sticking all that together, we really are seeing a move beyond that to transparency in terms of help us understand as well as we can the impact of this company on a number of different things. So my view would be that actually the move has been away from bundled up ratings and towards more granularity and transparency of underlying data. So I see that as very encouraging.
I'm going to ask you one last question, then open up the floor. You have a fascinating PhD, which is around the changing behaviors of people towards climate change. And forgive me if I'm oversimplifying, but I'll give you the opportunity to correct it. But one of the real kind of step changes that we've seen globally over the last few years is the population-driven, consumer-driven awareness, and that has pushed large corporates to buy more sustainably and sell more sustainably, and financial institutions to start thinking about these things. It wasn't risk-based approach, it was consumer-based change. And so I wanted to ask you, how would you characterize the anatomy of the changing behavior? And as a scientist and observer of behavior, what will happen next, if you care to predict?
It's such a nice question for you to ask, because this piece around each of us consumers really understanding how we can have agency and what we might want to do and change, that's profound. That is a profound part of how we're going to change things moving forward. So, for example, both the work that I did for my PhD on why we do the things we do from the perspective of environmental behaviors that we know might be bad or we know might be good, it really all comes down to us wanting to convey our values to the world around us or to reinforce them to ourselves. So the more that we create a narrative and awareness around what's going on out there in the world in relation to our decisions, and the more we reinforce the positive direction of travel as a social norm, the more we will be likely to take little steps, little easy steps to be able to achieve that. So that's the other thing. You have to nudge yourself to do it or be nudged. And then it has to be easy to complete these actions. So, for example, in the area of finance, what not many of us know is that around about half of that $120 trillion I mentioned before that is invested in capital markets is invested on behalf of median income households, so us. What that means is if we could start to understand the impact of our investment decisions on the world around us, so what is the carbon footprint of the companies in which we invest? Or what is the nature footprint of the companies in which I invest? What do I care about? Is it climate? Is it nature? What exactly is it that I want to have an impact on? If I can do that, then it's actually 27 times more effective to shift my retirement savings or some of my investments than it is to make small lifestyle changes. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't make small lifestyle changes, but what I'm saying is part of this technological development that we have at our fingertips is the ability to now reveal to us, you and me, the impact of our investments and of our decisions on the world around us. And that's down to the technology that we've developed. We're doing this at FNZ. We're now running on about $200 billion worth of investment savings with this information. So at scale now, you can choose a company and you can see exactly how it's delivering from the perspective of the things that you care about, and you can make a different choice. So the role of agency that we have is so powerful, and it's a crucial part of how we're going to change things.
I'd love to hear how you calculated the 200 billion in saving, but I'll leave the floor to the audience now. And if there's a gap between their questions, I'll come back and ask that. So do we have any hand? We have a few. Oh, Dr. Ali has his hands up. Let's give him the floor.
Thank you, Hussein. Thank you, Vian, for a very interesting discussion. You've talked about pricing nature services. You're talking about it mainly from a valuation perspective, but I think you've alluded to the role of government, because major problem, what we call externality, is that those prices are not directly inflicted on the company. Now, that's one aspect of it. Now, the other aspect also is communities, the role of communities. How do you democratize the data? So I, as a community, would have the data to tell I should boycott this company, or I should avoid financing or putting my pension plan in those type of a company. And this is not an easy question, I understand, but it has to do with the governance. Lots of people talk about community science. Lots of people talk about civic science, which is a way of democratizing that I, as a community, actually collect or create the data that you're talking about, because then I'm really in the driver's seat, not somebody driving me. So I just want to hear because it's really about governance in the end, about ecosystem governance. Just want to hear your views about this. Thank you.
Sure. Well, the first thing I'd say is that ask. If someone's investing money on your behalf, you have every right to ask for this information. It exists. I mean, at a greater or lesser level, depending on what you want to know and depending on where you're invested. So there should be no barrier to you asking for this information. And the more people ask, the more it will be provided. So I've come across a lot of different stories where people have not been told that there are other options around sustainable investing, for example, because it's probably easier just to stay where you are. But if you have a view on where you want to direct your agency, then the data does exist for it to be delivered to you, and you have a right to understand it if you want to. In terms of governance and community engagement and the role of governments, you're quite right. The impacts are not symmetrical. And so as this area of nature markets start to evolve, we talk about nature specifically here, there is, thank goodness, in organizations like the Task Force for Nature Markets, in terms of even some of the regulation and legislation that's coming out, a focus on how equitable outcomes can be achieved. Often you have incredible biodiversity being nurtured and looked after by the communities that live alongside it, for example. And there's a move to make sure that that distribution of benefit that comes into nature markets does go to the people who live alongside it. And indeed, that has to happen if we are to make those ecosystem services or those ecosystems more valuable than getting rid of them, which ultimately is the choice that we're going to have to make in terms of how we inhabit this planet. Do we clear land? Do we drill for resources? Or do we leave certain ecosystems intact? And these are profound decisions. And it is absolutely the responsibility of the country to think about how those outcomes are achieved. But also, I think the increasing scrutiny on companies is going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. I hope that answered your question.
Roland, I don't know if that's applause or a hands up, but if anybody has their hand up, can you just clearly, oh. Okay, well, let me ask you one. I think some of the people on this group, and well, I'm one of them, probably are looking, where can I make a difference? And you've just said, ask the questions, use your voice, make people who stand to influence the debate, answer difficult questions. But I'm keen to know a little bit about your story. You had a career in luxury items PR, and then you moved into finance and had 15 years in finance, and you could have pursued many routes in finance. Can you maybe tell us how your career pivoted towards this within the finance industry?
Yeah, of course. So it was a really unique combination of things that led me here. One of the transitions I made, it was always fascinating to me during that brief stint in working with luxury goods that items that cost very little to make could be sold for so much. And that made me think about demand and why we do the things we do. And that really started to hit home when I moved into finance and I was responsible for corporate social responsibility programs. So I started traveling extensively around sub-Saharan Africa and starting to experience this world of nature that I'd just never encountered before. So places like South Africa, Kenya, Namibia, Botswana, Congo, these are places where I remember one moment on a sort of sunset night where a baby cheetah was coming up to this car that we were driving in on this beautiful Kenyan plain. And it really struck me, and that must have been in about 2010, how precious this all was, and how, because of the threat of land use change, poaching, the illegal wildlife trade, this was disappearing really, really fast. And it probably was never going to come back once it's gone. That's the thing. This isn't easily reversible. Once those incredible ecosystems are gone, once that nature is gone, once the iconic species are gone, not coming back in a hurry. It can restore itself with thought and time and care, but better to preserve it in the first place. And so that led me to do some quite deep work alongside the work I was doing in the finance sector, very early days in terms of sustainability at that point, on why endangered species were under threat, the economics of the demand and supply equation around illegal wildlife. At that time, one rhino horn was worth something like $60,000 a kilo. It's incredibly high prices, and look into the drivers of demand for why this trade was existing. It's a huge and unknown trade, the illegal wildlife trade, certainly much more in the spotlight now through the great work of His Royal Highness Prince William and others bringing and shedding light on this. And that increasingly led me to understand that actually economics and the drivers of supply and demand, the communities that are living alongside wildlife, were crucially important to the preservation of these areas. Also started to work in projects like Virunga in the Congo, where one of Africa's oldest national parks is under threat of being drilled for oil. With rising oil prices, that threat increases. So these trade-offs, these economic and political decisions really influenced my view that let's first start to surface information on nature to people who are making really powerful decisions, whether that be the finance sector or whether that filters up to policymakers, how those two things interact. Let's start by showing them what the risk and the impact is, and then we can start to make different decisions. So for me, it's been a journey I didn't really choose. It chose me, and I'm very blessed to be completely aligned in terms of what I think I'm doing here in life, which is a really wonderful place to be.
Vian, I mean, it's inspirational and it's wonderful, but board meetings across the world are being had about budgets and supply chain cost explosions and so on. And, rarely are they saying, oh, but be careful, that cheetah may become extinct. You have chosen a steep mountain to climb in terms of providing the data that arm executives with the courage to face their shareholders and say, well, what if we did concede 20% of our profit margins for not a broader good, to manage the longer term risks of the business? Are you optimistic that the quality of the data that you can provide can drive investment, and in brackets, financing decisions for nature in this way?
I think because we're raising awareness, not me, but it's part of a much broader group, whether it be the regulator or disclosure frameworks or whoever it may be, policymakers setting goals collectively, and we can only do it together. So really we stand on the shoulders of giants and we work as a collective to actually make this happen. It is actually happening. So now if you're a mining company, you do have to consider the reputational risk from not observing your risk to biodiversity. And that's going to start to spread across a number of different sectors, because this is a landmark moment for disclosures around nature. That's why when I heard about the Task Force for Nature-related Disclosures, I couldn't believe it. I mean, it's been a very long time on this path, not as long as many, but it is difficult to raise awareness around the importance of these issues, because it's fundamental to the longer term future of how we want this planet to be and how we want our children to live and our grandchildren, however many generations in the future. And these conversations are actually starting to be had in boardrooms, amazingly. So we have to build on that momentum, I think. Like, you may have some stories to share from the early days of climate, for example.
Can you point the audience towards some resources or organizations who are really pioneering and far ahead in valuing nature? Like, who would be the first people you would go to with your data, because you know that they would take it and convert it into exactly the outcome you hope to achieve? Who can we look to as good examples?
Now, we're pretty early on in that journey, but I would recommend Finance for Biodiversity's work on valuing nature highly. Vivid Economics, fantastic work. But everyone from McKinsey through to EY through to the World Economic Forum has something to say now on nature, which I think starts to exemplify how it's at the forefront of the agenda in a way that it hasn't been before. But that has to stay there. And I think the disclosure requirements will help it stay there. I'll give you an example. There were solar panels on the roof of the White House in the 70s. You know, these things can come and go if we don't hold on to it. I remember a McKinsey report of 2010, top 3 risks to CEOs. One of them was biodiversity. Well, where did that go over the last 12 years? So it's really important that we hold on to this. And I think that's why the regulation is going to start to take hold. I see a couple of hands up from Roland and Karen.
Let's take the question from Roland, please.
Thank you. There was the issue of regulators, policymakers, and Al-Ani said it all has to come bottom up. And I'm going now top down. The European Union Recovery Fund for restoring after COVID has a very nice, I would say, a very nice or very interesting connection, which says it will only find, the European Union Fund will only finance projects in that regard, which also have an effect on the mitigation of climate change, which is nature. And that's a very good idea. It's very difficult because we come up with valuation and things like that. And so my video, I can do my video if you.
That's all right. Jump to your question, Roland, please.
Yeah. So the question is, do you think a regulation like this will contribute to what you are talking about? It's not really cheetahs, and I have a nice experience in teaching in Ghana. I know what nature is in Africa, but closer to home, we have to also deal with this. And the European sets an example. European Union sets an example of which I'm not convinced that it will be probably, because again, you have to break down the community level. And if there's a project, or whatever, to restore a dam, it's clear there is a consequence that relates to mitigation of climate change consequences. But there are other issues where it's not so easy. So at least I wanted to contribute this issue. There is some sort of regulation which connects very hard finance, 750 billion euros, to natural issues. The path is a little difficult. Not every project will be able to do this, but it's a good arena for people like you to intervene and see how this can be done in numbers and with effect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roland. What your comment has made me reflect on is taxonomies like the EU taxonomy. This is asking every investment really to be broken down, so every company to be broken down into whether its activities do mitigate climate change or contribute to adaptation. It's very granular. It's actually very hard to implement. We're in the process of doing it at FNZ, so that we're doing it in the context of you as an end investor picking an investment where you can see how aligned the investment is with those issues, so adaptation and mitigation. And increasingly there'll be other criteria. So it's incredibly granular. I think it's difficult, but there's leadership there. I also am interested in how the rest of the world will follow or respond. So we know the UK's following suit. What will happen in the US, we'll have to see, and in other parts of the world the same. But I do think it's a good move in a direction which is taking into consideration these elements, and it's hard to do, but it's being dealt with. So thank you very much for that reflection, Roland.
Thank you. Karen, you have a question as well. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you, Hassam. Okay, well, thank you to Roland. Hi, Roland. Because that sort of part of that was my question, was about trying to link everything up and bringing things back to where people are. I think there's a danger when, and I mean, I'm sure you had a very interesting journey going to Africa, but I mean, what I worry about that sort of story is that people think nature is something that is different disconnected from them. We are part of nature. And I'm always very keen to sort of try and emphasize that. And one of the exercises in fact, I didn't end up doing it because it was going to take too long, but was just to get people to breathe in and just to reflect on our dependency on oxygen. But where does oxygen come from? It comes from the species on this planet. It didn't exist before there was life in the little organisms in the sea, I assume it must have been. So I think there's a danger of really focusing too much on nature that is elsewhere, people that are elsewhere. So I thought actually just getting people to step outside and engage with nature. And I say I don't like that expression because it tends to suggest we're something other than nature, and that is part of the problem. But just trying to develop a better understanding of our dependencies is what I think is so important. So I suppose my question was really around and how tied up you think these things are or need to be or can be from a financial perspective, given that the IPCC, their most recent report, has actually really highlighted the whole cycle and interdependencies between climate change, biodiversity and soil use in particular. I mean, they say if we pick up a handful of soil, 80% of the organisms in there aren't even named yet. So understanding this knowledge gap, I think, is, and yes, metrics can do a certain amount and finance can maybe do a certain amount, but are there any particular things you think might help? So we don't get into are we going to spend money on climate change or are we going to spend it on biodiversity? We shouldn't get into that thinking because they're all joined up.
You're so right. You're so right, Karen, and thank you for that. It's, I think maybe many of us during COVID, for example, really did start to appreciate the fact that when we went outside, we could breathe the fresh air, see the sunlight, whatever little patch of grass we had near us, we experienced that, or the park or the walk in the middle of the day. We are absolutely nature, and it's a profound thing to say. And this is where I guess the translation mechanisms come in, which is when you're dealing with the finance sector. Certainly, I've felt that we have to build knowledge and awareness, as you've said, start to build awareness around the linkages, which, as you've referenced, the IPCC report is doing, and others have started to do, some of the names I've mentioned before in their research. How do we make it real for the audiences to whom we're speaking? And how do we make it actionable? I agree with you. It's very important to appreciate the dependencies that we have through the little things that you've just mentioned. Breathing in the air, appreciating how we are part of this. For constituencies like, yes, exactly, issues that are meaningful. For other sectors, that's where the translation comes in. How do we make it meaningful to them? What languages are they speaking, and how can they hear the value of nature? And the role of an investor is to observe their fiduciary duty, and that part of that is understanding value. Now, I'm not a particular advocate of putting a financial value on nature, but it's interesting to see whether that will take hold and whether that will make things meaningful, or whether the concept of risk from nature dependency and impact is going to start to factor into investment decision making again in a slightly different way. So this concept has absolutely, as you've said, of making it meaningful and tangible, and taking the opportunity to engage in whatever way you can. That, I think, is the most important thing. So for me, this was my path. This is the inspiration that I had, and I had this. I'm very humbled to be able to serve in this way. For others, I'm sure around this virtual table, there will be other ways that you may choose to engage. And that may just be absorbing for yourself the value of nature.
I don't see any other hands up, and I'm keen that we finish on time, and I'd rather finish 2 minutes ahead than 2 minutes later. So let me ask you kind of a parting question, unless somebody pops their hand up just before the hammer drops. But it's this. This is a session on financing climate, and there are climate finance. I am a climate financier. For the financiers on the call and who will listen and download this afterwards, what is your parting message to the financiers?
Time horizons, understand your own position in relation to what's coming down the pipe. I think the challenge is that we think it's very far away, the change that we're going to see, but the sorts of global commitments that have been put in place are speedily advancing towards us, so that time horizons are becoming very, very short. And it's one of those things, we think things are going to take ages to change until they do, and then they happen really, really fast. My sense is that with the technologies I've seen around me, the data I've seen around me, that there is such a profound opportunity in this space, the climate nature nexus being the next wave.
I think we'll leave it there. I can already see people starting to leave. I'll leave the audience with this thought. It wasn't until Brazil did a thorough machine learning exercise where they studied 150,000 images acquired over 35 years by the NASA Landsat satellites that they discovered that they had actually, in the span of 30 years, lost about 15% of their freshwater supply. So data is necessary, and machine learning and artificial intelligence is a key tool in understanding risk and understanding impact, whether it's natural trends or it's man-made impact. But the challenge remains, I think, for all of us to put a price tag to understand what it is that the people have to pay to recover the situation. Thank you, Dr. Vian Sharif, our new friend of the Gerhardt Center Speaker Series. For the audience, please stay tuned for further talks coming up on the Speaker Series. Thank you for participating tonight. If we could give a round of applause, I know we would. But until then, thank you all, and see you on future episodes.
Thank you so much, Hazam.
All right, bye everybody.